Hello, everybody. Welcome to the green room of Disrupt TV. Here with my amazing producer, Elle, our secret weapon, Esteban Kolsky, who is in for Bala Ashar, who's out today, and of course, our two amazing guests. I'm going to have them introduce themselves and tell us what they're coming in, where they're coming in from, like what city, and more importantly, what they're talking about today. So, Daniel, where are you coming in?
Well, I'm coming in from Santa Barbara, California, and really looking forward to the conversation about this wonderful book that Geoffrey, who's next, will comment about. But it's about the history of Next, the company that Steve Jobs and I and four others co-founded in 1985. Long story short, we'll have a good conversation about that history and Steve's growth and change over time.
It is an amazing story. And Geoffrey, thank you so much for being on the show. Where are you coming in from today?
Great to be here. So I'm joining from Asbury Park, New Jersey, and I come from a background as a technology writer and journalist, and I'm the author of the new book, Steve Jobs and Exile, which Dan'l very graciously just introduced.
Oh, we're so excited to have you here. We're going to turn it back to Elle. She's going to do the count, and we'll kick it off from here. All right, Elle, all you.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Disrupt TV. You're here with my amazing co-host today, Esteban Kolsky, who's in for Bala Ashar. And more importantly, we've got two amazing guests. I'm Ray Wong with Constellation Research, and we're going to kick this off today with two amazing guests talking about Steve Jobs in Exile, the untold story of America's greatest visionary. And of course, we've got Geoffrey Cain and Dan'l Lewin. They'll be sharing with us their insights from here. But let's do some quick introductions, and I'm going to do a bio, and it's going to take us a little bit longer than normal, but we're going to go through the bio, and we'll start with Geoffrey. Geoffrey Cain is an award-winning author and correspondent who sits down with world leaders, tech founders, and dissidents. His book, Samsung Rising, was long listed for the FT and McKinsey Business Book of the Year, and The Perfect Police State was named NPR's Book of the Day. He appears on WSJ, Times, Economist, Wired, has been featured on CNN and Bloomberg TV. He also advises executives, government officials on innovation, but he's also a darn good writer. We've also got Dan'l Lewin. He's served as president and chief executive officer of the Computer History Mission in the past. He's been directing strategic planning, fundraising, daily operations, but prior to that, he spent 17 years at Microsoft. He was also early at Next, Apple, Go, and Sony. And before joining Microsoft in 2001, he was CEO of Origin Systems. Remember that? It's an early innovator in IP and asset management, one of the OGs of Silicon Valley. We are honored to have both of you here today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Esteban.
Thank you, Ray, and welcome to our great guest. As I was saying before the show, I'm so looking forward to this. I think that the contributions of Jobs during his exile, to put it in a nice way, have been completely underplayed in the market. So let's start with that. Let's start with a simple question. What was the most significant part of the, what came out of a job being an exile? Either one of you. I mean, let's start with you, Dan'l.
Sure. I think the thing that most people overlook, and it certainly was not covered in what is the sort of the story of Steve and everything that's been written, is the fact that Steve co-founded Apple and 7 years later was fired. Next, where he co-founded with 5 others, of which I was one, was a 12-year run in his life. Prior to Apple acquiring Next for the technology. But in the end, Steve's participation and growth during that 12-year period was fundamental to, frankly, saving Apple, because they were without a technology roadmap that was sufficient, and without the technology that Next brought to the table, and without Steve's growth during that period, which Geoffrey brilliantly covers in the book. It's not clear that the technology alone would have been the savior of Apple, because they were in trouble. They were about a quarter away from running out of money and going out of business. And Steve's growth as an individual and a leader were fundamental to re-engaging the company and having Apple get its mojo back. And then now today, there isn't an Apple product that is not driven by the core technology with which we built at Next, starting in 1985. So there's an arc there that needs to be discussed if you really want to look at the history of Steve's life and Apple. This 12-year period has been neglected. The story needed to be told.
You know, Geoffrey, just look. Oh, go ahead, Dan. Sorry. Oh yeah, Geoffrey, I was gonna say, like, just like the lost decade in Japan. I mean, this is what was happening in the lost decade in Apple. I mean, but you chronicle that, and really, let's go deep. Like, what was Steve thinking at the time? I mean, he's just been thrown out of his company by the people he trusts. His board members have pretty much said, we don't trust your judgment anymore. And here he goes out and he's about to start something new. Like, is he angry? Is he upset? Is he going to change the world? Like, what's going on in his mind? And why those 4 other founders?
Well, what I found in my writing of this book is that Steve, what everybody told me was that Steve was deeply hurt and angry about being sidelined and fired from Apple. Apple was his baby. It was the company that he had co-founded, that he had dedicated his life to. And the people who were with him at the time all recounted how it was really a tragedy for him, because his entire life had been Apple. And once you tear that out of you, it's like losing a piece of your soul. It's just something that's so unbearable for somebody like him. And so the founding of Next, the whole idea behind it was that Steve wanted to create what was called a 3M computer. And this was something that Dan'l personally witnessed quite a bit and could talk about more, that this idea of a superpowered computer for the era, for the 1980s, which would be usable by scientific researchers, intelligence agencies, and so forth, big institutions. And one of the big target markets was universities, so departments, research labs. The idea, Steve would talk about this, that he wanted a dorm room, a student in a dorm room at Stanford could cure cancer with one of these things. That was the level of vision that Steve really wanted from this company. And so he took his co-founders. So he went into Apple. He recruited 5 people who were some of the most talented people there, from what I've heard, and brought them over to Next Computer at great risk to them, because you have to remember at the time, it's not like today where we have this image of Steve Jobs as the brilliant man in the turtleneck who's, building this beautiful iPhone that's going to change the world. At the time, his celebrity was not the same as it was today. And if a lot of this had gone differently, if he had failed for good, if he had not been able to get Next Computer off the ground at the end, he might have found himself in a situation where he would have been kind of forgotten or faded from history. None of this was guaranteed, and who he became was never fully guaranteed at the end. It was this tortuous path, this journey, this wilderness journey, leaving Apple and being cast out, having to start over again and build a company from scratch. It was truly terrifying for a lot of the people who were involved. And if it had gone any differently, this is like the big lesson that I took away from writing this book. If there were so many points where it could have gone any differently, and he could have made a different decision, and something different could have happened, and this whole story might have just turned out to be something completely different from what we know today. Like no Apple, there would be no iPhone, and so forth.
Do you think, Geoffrey, to follow up on that, do you think that like you said, that resentment, that anger towards those people who fired him is what actually fueled and powered Steve Jobs during the Exile to create Next and to actually find a way back to Apple? Is that what you found in your research?
Yeah, I think that was the fire in his belly. I think that was what he wanted. It was ultimately vengeance. It was revenge over having been pushed out of the company that he had given his life to. So a lot of the decisions he made early on, he was trying to outdo Apple and trying to outdo the CEO of Apple who pushed him out, a guy named John Sculley. And you see this over and over again. He makes these decisions that will certainly decisions that build a really fast, awesome computer for the age, something that's going to blow people away. But from a market perspective, when it comes to actually selling the thing, that's where it gets complicated. And I do believe that he made these decisions that didn't quite make sense from a business standpoint, because he wanted to show the world that he's going to make his comeback from Apple, that this is his moment in the crucible, but he's going to overcome it, and he will show Apple who the real Steve Jobs is.
That is amazing. And when you think about that transformation, Dan'l, you were there on the front lines. Contrast the Steve Jobs you knew walking into Next, the Steve Jobs you knew going into Apple, and that day he walked back.
Yeah, I think Jeff nailed it. I'll put some of the quant and context around the market dynamic at that moment in time. When we founded Next in the fall of 1985, September, Apple was a little more than $1 billion in annual sales, gross sales. Think about it.
I can't imagine how small that number is.
And in 1986, Oracle went public, Microsoft went public, Adobe went public. Sun Microsystems was a $400 million run rate company. Sun's gone, right? Oracle, So, and IBM, so I encourage everyone to read the book about the potential of the partnership that did not materialize between Next and IBM. IBM was a $40 billion a year annual run rate company.
They're the big dogs.
That's what the computer industry was like. And the idea of this concept of a 3M machine, which Geoffrey just described, emanated from Carnegie Mellon, where a lot of the fundamental computer science and frankly robotics and AI work and the Mach kernel, which later at Next, Avi Tevanian came in from Carnegie Mellon and brought the Mach kernel, which was a research project, which is the essence of the very portability of Next Step to other machines and other architectures and things. So the market context was amazing, and the energy that we all had. I was running 2/3 of Apple's business then. I had all of the education business. I'd set up all the business in higher education from scratch. There was no direct business to higher ed when I was at Apple. I pioneered that out of the Mac division, starting in 1983, 82, years before we actually launched the Macintosh. There were 10 people in the group. So you got to look at that context. And where Steve was then was this, everything's possible, because we had envisioned from Xerox PARC, the Xerox Star, and the Alto before that, and all the things that you've read about before, but you got to put it in the context of 6 of us and then another half a dozen that joined right away at Next, saying we can build something. And yes, it's going to take multiple years. It's not like product cycles today, but we can build something that can change the world, because we've got both the vision, and in this case, Steve had the resources, personal resources, which did all the initial funding. And then we built these partnerships around it, which we can talk about. But Steve's growth in that period of Next, to the core of your question, was pretty fundamental. My observation is because he had been sidelined and fired. Again, my observation, having been there and traveled with him and worked with him daily forever, my observation was that he felt like he had to be the boss at Next in the beginning. And I think over that 12-year period, he realized he needed to be the leader. And I think that's what he took back to Apple, in my opinion. is this notion, my definitions, I'm sure I've stolen it from someone else because there aren't very many original thoughts. The difference between a boss and a leader is that a boss bosses and kind of works in their own mind, and a leader leads and works in the open and empowers the organization and the people to follow. And I think in the beginning at Next, he was struggling with, I got to be the boss, because he was fired by the boss. And I think over time, he learned as a result of mishaps, failures, the transition that was required to keep Next alive, as opposed to his vision of how it would execute and survive. That all changed, and he had to actually go back to the markets. And if you'll bear with me for a second in closing my comment, Steve was a genius at building things that individuals would personally want. He never liked to build things that institutions would buy and give to people. So his core was about these personal use devices, and that's where Apple's ended. And he was genius at that. And he built a team of people that he could lead and that executed brilliantly, including the supply chain with Tim Cook and everything that we all know.
You know, I want to expand a little bit on that, because you mentioned before something that I would have never expect to hear from Steve Jobs, which is partnerships, right? There's so many stories of the beginning of Apple, Apple 1, Apple 2. Like I said, Steve being the boss versus being the leader. But partnerships is where you actually make the distinction between boss and leader. The leader says, I need more help to grow than whatever I can get from what I know and what I'm doing. So let's find those stuff. Talk a little bit more about, you said we're going to talk later. This is a perfect time. Let's talk a little bit more about those partnerships that Steve was bringing into Next, if you don't mind.
Yeah, happy to. And I think I'm going to encourage everyone to read the book. Geoffrey really dives into each of the areas where the early phases of Next, we were presented, all because of Steve's energy and his persona. You know, all the doors were available. We could knock and they would open. People were curious about what was going to happen. They were curious about meeting him. Infant terrible, if you will, all the things, you know, that people have written. We were presented with an amazing opportunity at a moment when Microsoft was struggling, if you will, to make Windows a functional operating system. You know, when we started Next, Windows 2.0 had just come on the market. And it wasn't until 3.1 that the networking extensions were even put in place, which gave them the flexibility to build Windows 95 and Office 95. So we're talking about 1986 here. And IBM at the same time was struggling and fighting against the rest of the PC industry, not wanting to be marginalized into a commodity provider of computers. That they knew leadership at IBM. We were dealing with the CEO and the vice chair, who was the highest ranking engineer ever at IBM, Jack Keeler. We were dealing with these guys in their offices. There was a joint logo plate designed that had Next logo and IBM's logo on it to go to market together. These stories Geoffrey codifies, but there's a lot behind it. And IBM was falling out with Microsoft on the OS2 project, for those that remember or could look it up. And they wanted to partner with us in a unique way and to share in the success of building the Next Step operating system into IBM's personal computing vision, and to go worldwide and global with it at a time when, you know, a Windows machine barely functioned and was still character driven, long way away from a graphical interface that had made any sense, which was really Windows 95. So there was this great runway for these things to occur. And the struggle that I think Steve had, and which is why, again, read the book, read the end of the first third of the book, you know, I left, and I left on my own, chose to leave because all of these partnerships had fallen apart as a result of Steve's desire to go it alone. And I think he later on learned, and then clearly, you know, partnerships and ISV ecosystems are fundamental to all companies' success in this area.
Well, tied back into that, Jeff, I mean, was he this is the hero shithead roller coaster that's going on here, right? they're working their way towards the first release, October 12th at Louis Davies Symphony Hall in San Francisco. I mean, it must have been hectic trying to get something out the door with this pendulum of Steve extracting a mental toll on all his engineers at the same time with the pressures to get a device out. I mean, and if I remember, what, it's $6,500 for the device when it came out? I mean, that's
$6,500 in 1988. So
in
by today's
1988.
money, that's it's around $15,000. And then, but then there's also the add-ons. And one of the big problems with the Next Cube, as the computer was called, is that for it to function, you had to also buy a hard drive, and there were, you know, 2 different options for a hard drive, and you know, you had to get more space. Like, basically, what had happened is that Steve had this gargantuan vision to be a part of the course of history. That was his dream, to, you know, bend the arc of reality and to, you know, to bring history forward with new technology. He was always about that. And what happened here is that he set goals that were so ambitious to the point of being audacious. He told the team, we're going to make a perfect cube out of magnesium, which is both flammable and expensive, with black matte paint that's also very expensive. And, you know, I was actually going through the archives. I got, you know, the original cost balance sheet for, you know, for making this cube computer, this perfect 90-degree cube. And the cost had gotten out of control by the time, you know, it was ready to launch. It was delayed many times. There was no distribution network, and as Dan'l can attest, there were a lot of efforts to bring in other companies. So IBM would have put the Next Step operating system on their computers. You know, there was a company called Businessland, for people who can remember it. It's sort of like a, you know, the Best Buy of the day for computers specifically. They were going to line up a big retail deal, and they were going to sell Next computers across the country. But one by one, these partnerships fell apart. You know, Ross Perot, who later became the 2-time presidential candidate, one of the first populist candidates, who was ironically very successful with his infomercials. He would teach you know, people across the country about fiscal discipline. That was his big thing. And I found it so kind of ironic and a little funny when I was writing the book, because here's Ross Perot, you know, saying that, you know, people in the government and companies need to spend less. And, you know, he was literally in the office with Steve Jobs at these board meetings, like telling him, Steve, your spending is out of control. He hired IM Pei, this famous architect, to create a floating, like a staircase that looks like it floats. And you know, it goes on and on. Like, the chairs were $10,000, and he tore out the color of the grout in the bathroom. The space between the tiles was off shade, so he had it all torn out, and it cost $20,000 to replace it all. Like, that's the level of spending that was going on here. But there was no product. I mean, there was nothing being sold. It was simply, you know, it was a venture with an untested idea that was taking money from Ross Perot, IBM, and, you know, hopefully getting sales from Businessland. But because Steve was being so hard-headed about his vision, none of this materialized in the end. And one by one, everybody peeled off. So that, you know, there's a lesson in all of this, and the lesson is, you know, look, it's one thing to be a visionary founder, and that's how I see Steve in his early years. He really was a visionary, and that was his talent. He could walk into a room, you know, with his little Macintosh computer, which, you have to remember, the first Macintosh was it was $8,000 in today's money, and released in 1984. It could draw and paint. Like, it was a very simple machine. It was revolutionary because it simplified, you know, the old computers of the past that were clunky and difficult to use. And he brought it to usability. He democratized it, and he brought it out to the public. But the thing is that it was underpowered, and you know, sales did not persist for that long. It actually wasn't a major commercial success. Against what we remember today. We tend to think of it as this big bang moment where the whole world changed. But what Steve was doing, you know, he was always able to sell that vision. The Macintosh is going to change the world. The next computer is going to change the world. But I think that this period, once he was cast out and forced to start over and to do it again, to rebuild his life, to rebuild, you know, the past glory that had defined him at his first years at Apple. I think what the test was for him was, can you not just be a visionary, but can you also be a businessman? You know, how do you build a distribution network? How do you, run the balance sheets? How do you build the partnerships? Even if you have partners like IBM who you personally do not like, there's that famous photo of Steve Jobs standing in New York. He's giving the finger to the IBM logo. That's like one of the most famous shots of him. He doesn't like a lot of, what these institutions are doing, and he doesn't like who they are. But he has to learn to work with them in the end, and he has to learn to sell to intelligence agencies, and he has to learn to port his software to other people's computers, which is so against, the Apple control ethos. But it's this lesson of pragmatism, the taming of Steve Jobs. And once he learns to fuse that brilliant vision that he always has with the practical, everyday business realities, the market realities that are always so difficult and even a little boring sometimes, once he fused those, I think that's where he became the force, the world-changing force who could return to Apple and save it from bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So Daniel, this kind of dovetails into where you started talking about the growth of Steve Jobs as a person, right? What he was at next, how he went from being like, I'm the greatest innovator that does everything by myself to like, I'm going to build a company that we could be proud of and that delivers something. What was the timeline that you remember, from that? I mean, did it take 6 months? Did it take like 5 years? I mean, how did it come along into that state of mind?
My impression, when I quit, I resigned, and again, Jeff chronicles it very well. It was a board meeting, and thereafter I got on a plane, went to the East Coast, and told the folks on the East Coast that I was going to resign the next day, which is what I did. And I think at that stage, Steve was still in another place. He still was kind of lost in his notion of being a boss. Later on and thereafter, which gets into the second and third parts of the book, I was not there. And I think John Rubinstein and others who were party to that, and the team that went with him back to Apple, were the ones who can comment best about when the bit flipped, if you will, and Steve had a sense of humility, if you will, that allowed him to kind of lead a process rather than trying to boss everyone into his worldview, because he had obvious controlling interest. He owned more than 50% of the company, and he was. So Ross quit the board, and Canon was an investor. They had given us $100 million, and they had their points of view as well. He had and again, that's all chronicled very, very nicely. But I think the thing that may be most important, there's a video that people I'm sure have seen that care about Steve and have been following it, that when he went back to Apple and he was introducing the Think Different campaign, and someone in the audience of Apple employees called him out for, and I'll use the phrase, you're full of shit. You know what you're talking about. And it was an employee at Apple on a set of technical issues. And Steve paused and thought, and then responded and said, you may be right, and you probably are right about a lot of things that I don't know. So this witnessing of Steve responding to a challenge in a public forum, and acknowledging, and then taking it back to his vision, that transition and that growth was, to me, when I saw that video, it's like, oh, he really gets it. Now, the success of Apple, obviously retooling, simplifying the product line, all the things he was genius at, getting rid of the bad products, there are 15 different variations on a Performa or whatever the machine was called, and narrowing it down to those candy colored ones, and building a real foundation for Apple's reemergence. Over time, the thing that they did extraordinarily well with Steve's vision and great engineers around him was to disassemble other markets, right? The music industry went to Sony and said, you need to give me your product in 99-cent chunks, a song at a time. And if you don't, I'm going to tell my customers to steal your product. Remember those billboards? right? And so Sony caved, and then everybody else caved, and it was the iPod and a Windows application for the iPod to store music that gave them the ability to get new Apple computers into people's homes on their next purchase. Every 3 years, people buy a new machine. So the disassembly, and then the phone market. So they were looking at the ambient nature of digital technology being present in everything that we do in society, which is where Apple dominates now. And that gets back to his core about wanting to build for a person. And then the earbuds, you know, everybody wants to dance like no one's watching, right? It's all about the psychographic of the person's mind in the buying moment. That's where he was really genius.
So when we look back, I mean, if we had to simplify this, I mean, was Next a failure? Was Next a success? How would you crash that? Because I know you go super deep into this, Geoffrey, but was it a success? Failure?
It was. It's the way the history has been written. We remember it as a failure. We remember it as that middle space, that awkward middle space in the life of Steve Jobs, one of the great luminaries of our era, where he was wandering aimlessly. And the common narrative goes that he left Apple, he went to Next, he failed there, and then succeeded at Pixar, and then returned to Apple. But that is not true. That is just not an accurate retelling of history. What actually happened is that he went to Next. He abandoned the hardware at Next because the hardware just wasn't selling. It's not what people wanted. He abandoned it too late. The company was it was effectively bankrupt. And, according to the people who were closest to him, he was about 2 to 3 years away from running out of his own money. That's how much runway he had. You have to also remember that these were not major public companies. There were no IPOs yet. He was running these by himself and investing his own money. So he was in a perilous position. And it was around 1993 and 1994 that he hit absolute rock bottom, that Steve was effectively being forgotten. He was left off many of the lists of the day, like the top business leaders, Forbes business lists. He would be left out of those, and they would put Bill Gates on and Larry Ellison and his peers. Steve was not really seen at the time as the luminary who we know him as now. What happened in the end? The hardware was abandoned, and that was painful for so many people who were helping Steve along this path. But once he was able to let go of the need to control both the hardware and the software together, once he accepted that what the customers wanted was his software, which was extremely powerful for the era, that's when the turnaround happened. And it was because he started listening to the people around him. The thing that he was famous for in younger life is that he just didn't listen. He would, he had the hero shithead roller coaster. One day, you do something good, you're a hero. The next day, you're a shithead, and he cuts you down, and you never quite know where you stood. That instinct of his started to tame around this period, and he started bringing in people, listening to them, integrating their ideas into his vision, so it wasn't just him bossing people around. And because he was able, throughout that decade of the 90s, to build such beautiful and powerful software, which is called object-oriented software. This was an operating system called Next Step. He was able to find ways to essentially allow developers to make software as they would mold clay or film a movie. So it's visually oriented. You can take what's called an object, and an object might be a dialogue box. You type information into there. It could be the enter button. Any these things that we all take for granted today. The drag and drop on the iPhone. A lot of this is object-oriented programming. Very novel for the time, very powerful, and so powerful that his competitors, even Apple, decided that it wanted to catch up to what Steve Jobs was doing. I mean, they had fired Steve Jobs, but about 8 years later, they realized that Steve was actually the one who was onto something. And so they decided that they needed to acquire Next Computer. This was the CEO, Gil Amelio, who had been brought onto Apple, which was about between 1 to 3 quarters away from bankruptcy, according to many estimates. Gil Amelio decided that the company wasn't turning around without Steve Jobs and without Next Computer, and he said, we need that software. So they made the acquisition in the end. This is the greatest business turnaround ever. I mean, I don't think there's a comparable story to this ever happening. Somebody being ousted from their company and then returning to save it from bankruptcy, and not just save it, but then releasing a whole tranche of massively successful products that reshaped all of technology and turned Apple into the most valuable company in the world. Now $4 trillion. I mean, it's right up there with all these other firms, NVIDIA and Microsoft and so forth. Like this story might have not happened if Steve Jobs had not returned to Apple, but it was because of that software. This was stuff that Dan'l was in marketing. Back when he was there, marketing, working at this partnership with IBM, a talented team, people such as Avi Tavanian, who was a software developer, Bud Tribble, a lot of these people, they joined Steve at Apple, and they went back and they created a renaissance. But it all started with the software, and it also started with the really brilliant team that he assembled around himself.
Yeah, I would add. Go ahead.
I think you're muted, Ray. You're muted.
Oh yeah,
sorry about that. Yeah, that was the failure of Copeland, right? To be able to make their way through.
Yeah,
So.
Apple was in deep. But
yeah,
to complement Jeff's comment, there's a cornerstone. Again, I'm a market context guy, and that's what I was working on then, and that's the way I think about these things. Got to recognize, again, I described what the market was in terms of IPOs and the size and scale of the industry and IBM and all that kind of stuff. By the time you get into the latter part of the 90s, after Steve's back at Apple with Next Step, the maturation of the assets of Next were wildly successful. The people and the technology. Did the company fail? Yes. Did the technology fail? No. The maturation of the people and the technology that is lasting, which is software, it grows over time. Hardware changes all the time. Form factors within which software lives changes all the time. The infrastructure technology upon which all of this stuff gets built, the layers, had been built up with Internet Protocol and the World Wide Web, which we don't want to dismiss because it was invented on a Next machine, because of Next Step,
Tim Berners-Lee,
and because of the capability of the object-oriented operating system, and in particular, the notion of runtime binding, so that you could build something and at runtime, it would lock in and bind to the application. That was way ahead of its time. And a guy named William Parkhurst was the person who worked for Bud Tribble who made the choice to go that direction. Everybody else has caught up to that. But back then, that was a fundamental bet and a really bold and long-term, very important decision.
And the protective memory and preemptive multitasking.
Oh, exactly. And that's where Avi's work with Mach came in, that lifted it all up, made it portable and all the rest. So the thing that was important for Steve is the computing power, which is, I think, what we're going to see in the future, just a forecast for Apple, my opinion, again. Computing at the edge, there's always more cycles at the edge than the core, but you need the cloud. But computing at the edge is always going to be the most powerful thing. And that's where Next Step lives on, and that's where Apple's strength comes from, and that all comes from Next. And so in the sense of Next is success, Next is successful because Apple exists and controls the edge. You can't take that away from Steve's commitment. Through all the foibles of spending way too much money on hardware and $50 on paint jobs and all kinds of weird stuff that were wrong.
It doesn't matter. The most fascinating part of what he just said is the fact that we keep thinking we're reinventing things every single time we have a new technology. We're now talking about edge computing like it never existed before, right? Oh, edge computer is going to change the way we do things. But I mean, I was one of the original users of Next computers. I had 2 computers in my computer lab, and we were talking about this earlier. And, the object-oriented, the preemptive multitasking, all the things that didn't exist for another easy 5 years, if not 10 years. And now edge computing that we're talking about like 30 years later, right? This is what we miss the most. And this is why it's great to have the book that Geoffrey wrote and your experience on this. Pick one thing that you think came out of Next that today is changing the way we're doing technology, enterprise computing, AI, Pick one thing. It doesn't matter. I mean, what's in your in your perception? One of the things that came out of that is the most interesting right now.
My 2 cents is the web objects. It's the stuff that was built towards the end, and Dell was, ironically, given Michael Dell's comment when Steve went back to Apple, and Michael suggested that Steve should just shut the company down and sell the assets.
This is strange. We actually have a question here.
Yeah.
Could you please give more details on how Web Objects was born and how the Dust Pro was implemented?
Yeah, for sure. I was not there when that work happened, but I was clearly paying attention. And so I don't know exactly which engineers were the ones that sort of, built that up and evolved, if you will, using all the web standards and web protocol, et cetera. But it was the commitment to Objective-C as opposed to C++, which was the cornerstone for object orientation and dynamic binding. And then web objects became, I'm sure Avi would have the best sense of it. It may very well be, Jeff, I can't recall if you covered that in the book. It's just it's an important piece. It's in there, I think. Yeah.
How about you, Geoffrey? What's your opinion of the best thing that came out of those years of being in Exile that is changing the world today?
You know what? I would agree with Dan'l that it is the web and its web objects. And so the web, this is an example of a civilization defining technology, something that literally warped civilization in a new direction, and something that was invented on a NeXT computer originally in 1990 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. One of the fascinating things about the history of the web is that as it was being invented, the people creating it did not see it as the network that it would be today, or they didn't see it as something where you would open a computer and you would be able to simply load a website and do this and that. It was originally supposed to be a system for sharing science papers that were being published at CERN, the major European laboratory. And what I find interesting, and this is a common theme in these years of Steve Jobs, these years of NeXT, is that there are lots of these projects, these sort of these side projects happening that would later turn out to be so far ahead of their time and so world changing, but that because they were so far ahead of their time, nobody at the time saw what was coming. The web is the best example of this. NeXT computers, the Next Step operating system, was perfectly attuned to the way that the web was being designed. And so here's the story of web objects that Dan'l mentioned earlier. It was 6 years after the invention of the web that the NeXT team decided to create software called web objects. And there was a specific problem that Steve was trying to solve. And it was that, back in the day, if you can, people can remember this, it was difficult doing things on the early web. So, you would load a website, it was static, it would be poorly designed with all these weird banger colors that jump out. Like it would be, the background is pink and the text is yellow and there's an animated GIF of a monkey dancing around. MIDI file plays, all this, sound comes on. I remember
awesome. What are you talking about? It was awesome.
It was awesome. It was a lot of fun. It felt like it was a Wild West, the people were doing fun things back then. But because websites were static, it was a really inefficient way of e-commerce. So, this is back before Amazon was big. I mean, Amazon was just being founded at the time. And Steve figured out that we need to find a place where we could replace the JCPenney catalogs. Like, we don't want companies to have to send out a catalog, every season to every single customer, and then they pick up the phone and order things. What we need to do is do that online, but make it so that the website can automatically refresh and recreate itself and update itself as the customer is going through and clicking on things. So, they had this demonstration of buying a car. That was one of the first ones. And Steve demonstrated one of the first websites where you could go into a car dealership and you could choose the color and the make and model, and then you get your car. And that's like Tesla, what they do today on their website. So this was many years ahead of its time. And the significance of web objects was that it took what was already happening on the web, but it was a delay. And Steve realized that NeXT computer is so perfectly made for the web, and he realized that the web was going to be a major defining tech for the decades to come. So he pivoted. He went from focusing on the operating system, Next Step, which was also very powerful and sophisticated, and he decided that Next should be the one to create this sophisticated web technology, seizing on what Sir Tim Berners-Lee had done many years earlier. But this was one of the factors. So, even when the Apple CEO, Gil Amelio, was talking about whether or not to acquire Next and to bring on Steve Jobs, he remarked that WebObjects was beautiful software. I mean, it was just known for its beauty in the industry. And it's what it's the original tech that put Next back on the map, back after the failures, because Dell showed up and Dell was interested in this. They were selling computers online. There were other companies, so Disney. So I was also told by somebody who worked with Steve that Bill Gates wanted to acquire Next for this specific technology. WebObjects was all the rage, and this is one of the things that got attention again. So that I think that's, to answer your question, I think that the software aspects of Next, the web aspects, pretty much, if you use Apple products today, you're essentially using Next software, but that software was built back in the early 1990s. I mean, that's how visionary this was. And yet I just find it so unbelievable at how, at the time, it was so hard to see, what was going to matter in the end and what was going to survive and what would be thrown out. Nobody really knew that Next would be this important going forward.
Absolutely. Just the little underpinning to that is, obviously you've had Vint on this, on your show, and IP everywhere, internet protocol everywhere, blows away nation state borders, right? And then CommerceNet, Al Gore invents the internet, right? No, he enabled legislation to allow commercial things to occur. And it's at exactly the same time that Geoffrey's description of what was going on with Next fell into market context.
An amazing.
Steve was genius at seeing those things and then figuring out how to make them material.
It's an amazing story of reinvention. We often learn from our failures. Something LLMs don't do a good job. I mean, 400 pages of in-depth analysis, understanding the mindset, the turnaround, and more importantly, how leaders can take failures and turn them into successes. It's an amazing book. So, Geoffrey, thanks for being on here. Dan'l, thanks for providing the on-the-ground, real-time insight from where you were there, and more importantly, the perspective of where the market is, and the history of where this is. Esteban.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you guys. I think that the untold story of Next is, like you said, the underlying growth of the computer industry in this century, basically, right? I mean, we are using what was built in the late 80s, early 90s. So this is fantastic. I really appreciate you guys being here. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, we'll see you guys in the green room. We're going to move on, and get over there. So thanks a lot. So,
thanks for having us, and thank Geoffrey for doing the book.
Oh yeah, definitely. So, all right, very cool. Well, we are headed to episode next week, episode 447. There's no show July 24th, July 31st. So, but we will be back August 7th with Christopher Lochhead. If you know him, the 13-time #1 best-selling co-author, and of course, father of category, or godfather of category design. He's going to be talking about a little bit more. We also got Neil Shore, the 25th hour, how to thrive and gain ridiculous amounts of time, I hope, by getting out of your own way. So that's what we have there. Any final thoughts, Esteban, for our show before we go to the green room?
No, I'm looking forward to next week. Anytime you and Chris get together is something to truly, experience. So I'm really looking forward to that. And it was a great show. Thank you very much for including me.
Well, if it's Friday, it's Disrupt TV. We'll catch you every Friday at 11 p.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thanks a lot.